After spending more than 40 years building his career in Hollywood, Charlie Chaplin boarded a ship in New York bound for London to attend the premiere of his new film. But while the ship was still crossing the Atlantic, a shocking decision was made. The United States government revoked Chaplin's re-entry permit. The man who had created the most recognizable character in film history was no longer allowed to return to America. A genius who made hundreds of millions of people laugh. So what happened? What made Hollywood turn its back on Charlie Chaplin? Long before that shocking moment in 1952, Charlie Chaplin had already become something the world had never seen before. He was not just a movie star. By the mid-1910s, he was arguably the most recognizable face on the planet. In 1915 alone, Chaplin's short films were drawing millions of viewers across Europe, America, and Asia, and the strange little character he created, the bowler hat, the cane, the oversized shoes, and the tiny mustache, had become instantly understood in every language. By 1918, Chaplin signed a contract worth $1 million, an almost unimaginable number at the time, making him the highest-paid entertainer in the world. Just 1 year later, in 1919, he helped create United Artists, a revolutionary move that allowed filmmakers to control their own work instead of surrendering power to Hollywood studios. Then came the films that would define silent cinema forever. The Kid in 1921, The Gold Rush in 1925, City Lights in 1931, and Modern Times in 1936. These films turned Chaplin into more than a comedian. He became a storyteller of poverty, dignity, and survival. By the 1930s, the small silent tramp had become one of the most powerful cultural symbols of the 20th century, which only makes the mystery deeper. How does a man who once ruled Hollywood end up being forced out of America entirely? Long before Charlie Chaplin became the most recognizable face in cinema, his life began in a world that looked nothing like the bright lights of Hollywood. He was born on April 16, 1889, in South London, into a family that was already struggling to survive. His father, Charles Chaplin Sr., was a music hall singer with a promising career, but alcoholism slowly destroyed both his reputation and his ability to care for his family. Chaplin's parents separated when he was still very young, and his father eventually disappeared from his daily life. Years later, Charles Chaplin Sr. would die from complications related to alcohol abuse, leaving behind little more than a cautionary shadow over his son's childhood. Chaplin's mother, Hannah Chaplin, had once been a performer on the music hall stage as well. She possessed a delicate singing voice and a natural presence in front of audiences. But her career began to collapse when illness damaged her vocal cords. One evening, while performing on stage, her voice suddenly failed. The audience began to grow restless, and the performance was falling apart. In a moment that would later become almost legendary, a small boy was pushed onto the stage to replace her. That boy was Charlie Chaplin. He began singing and mimicking the audience, turning their impatience into laughter. Coins were thrown onto the stage as applause. It was the first time Chaplin realized that humor could transform humiliation into survival. But outside the theater, the family's reality remained harsh. With his father absent, his mother's health deteriorating, Chaplin and his older half-brother Sidney were often left without stable income. Poverty followed them everywhere. There were periods when they could barely afford food, and the boys sometimes had to rely on charity or the kindness of neighbors. Eventually, the situation became so severe that Chaplin and Sidney were sent to a workhouse, a grim institution designed for the poorest members of society in Victorian England. Life there was strict and humiliating. Families were separated, routines were rigid, and dignity was rarely preserved. Chaplin later recalled how deeply those experiences shaped him. In the workhouse, he saw men who had lost everything still trying to maintain a sense of pride. He watched people who had nothing left attempt to carry themselves with a strange mixture of desperation and elegance. Those images stayed with him. Years later, when he created the character of the Tramp, audiences would see a man wearing worn-out clothes, yet walking with exaggerated dignity. The inspiration for that character had roots in those early years among the poor. The hardship intensified when Chaplin's mother began showing signs of severe mental illness. Her condition worsened over time, and she was eventually admitted to an asylum. For long stretches of his childhood, Chaplin and his brother were left to navigate the world almost entirely on their own. They moved between temporary homes, institutions, and cheap lodgings, always searching for some form of stability. At one point, Chaplin spent time in Central London District School for Pauper Children, where discipline was strict and life was far removed from warmth or comfort. Yet even in these circumstances, Chaplin showed an unusual ability to observe people. He watched how strangers walked, how drunk men stumbled through the streets, how wealthy gentlemen carried themselves with arrogance, and how the poor tried to imitate that same posture despite their circumstances. These observations slowly formed a kind of silent education. Chaplin learned that human behavior, even in its smallest gestures, could reveal entire stories. Entertainment soon became more than a distraction. It became a path out. As a young boy, Chaplin joined small performing groups and began appearing in minor stage productions. These early experiences were far from glamorous. The pay was small, the conditions unstable, and success was never guaranteed. But each performance helped him refine the skills that would later define his career. Precise timing, expressive movement, and the ability to communicate emotion without words. By the time Chaplin reached his teenage years, he had already spent more time observing the harsh realities of life than most adults. Poverty, abandonment, mental illness, and institutional life had all left their mark. Yet those same experiences gave him something unusual. They gave him an understanding of suffering that would later become the emotional core of his comedy. The world would eventually know Charlie Chaplin as the man who made millions laugh. But the truth was that long before the laughter began, he had already learned exactly how painful life could be, and that knowledge would shape every character he created from that moment forward. By the time Charlie Chaplin entered his teenage years, performing had already become more than a childhood experiment. It was the only path that seemed capable of pulling him out of poverty. London at the turn of the 20th century was filled with small theaters, traveling performers, and music hall stages where entertainers struggled nightly to earn a living. For Chaplin, those stages became a kind of training ground. He joined minor theatrical groups and slowly began to develop a reputation for his physical comedy and precise sense of timing. Unlike many performers who relied heavily on dialogue, Chaplin focused on movement, rhythm, and facial expression. Even then, he seemed instinctively aware that silence could sometimes communicate more than words. One of the most important opportunities arrived when Chaplin joined the famous comedy troupe led by Fred Karno. Karno's productions were built around elaborate physical routines and carefully choreographed chaos, where comedians had to tell entire stories through gestures, falls, and exaggerated reactions. This environment forced Chaplin to refine his physical control and sharpen his ability to hold an audience's attention without speaking. Night after night, he performed the same routines, learning how to adjust timing by fractions of a second to produce a bigger laugh. It was exhausting work, but it also gave him something invaluable: discipline. In 1910, Karno's troupe traveled to the United States for a touring production. For Chaplin, America felt like a completely different world. The cities were larger, the audiences louder, and the entertainment industry was expanding at a speed that London theaters could not match. Hollywood itself was still young, but the motion picture industry was already growing into a powerful new form of entertainment. Chaplin's performances during the tour began attracting attention, and his expressive style stood out in a field filled with traditional stage comedians. In 1913, a representative from Keystone Studios, one of the most active film companies of the time, noticed Chaplin during a performance. Keystone specialized in fast-paced slapstick comedies, films that relied heavily on physical humor and chaotic action. Chaplin was invited to join the studio, and by early 1914, he was appearing in his first motion pictures. At first, Chaplin was simply another performer within Keystone's production machine. Films were shot quickly, scripts were minimal, and actors were often expected to improvise physical gags on the spot. Chaplin followed the instructions given to him, but something about the process felt incomplete. He believed comedy could be more than a sequence of falls and chases. It could tell stories about people. During one production, Chaplin was asked to assemble a costume for a new character. He walked through the studio wardrobe room and began choosing pieces almost randomly. He selected baggy trousers that were too large, a tight jacket that felt slightly formal, oversized shoes that forced him to walk awkwardly, a bowler hat that suggested dignity, and a small cane that added rhythm to his movement. Finally, he added a small mustache that allowed his face to remain expressive while subtly changing his appearance. When Chaplin stepped onto the set wearing that combination, something unexpected happened. The character immediately felt alive. He was poor but proud, clumsy but determined, a man who had nothing, yet carried himself with the exaggerated confidence of someone who refused to surrender to humiliation. That character would soon become known as the Tramp. Audiences responded almost instantly. The Tramp was funny, but he was also strangely sympathetic. He represented the outsider, the person trying to survive in a world that constantly pushed him aside. Chaplin began refining the character with every film. The walk became more distinct, the gestures more precise, and the emotional range deeper. Instead of simply creating jokes, Chaplin started building small stories around the Tramp's struggles. As his popularity grew, Chaplin also became increasingly dissatisfied with the limitations placed on him by studio directors. He wanted greater control over how the films were made, how the scenes were constructed, and how the character evolved. Within a short time, Chaplin began directing his own films, writing his own scenarios, and gradually taking charge of the entire creative process. This level of control was unusual for actors in the early film industry, but Chaplin insisted that it was necessary. By the late 1910s, his instincts proved correct. Each new film attracted larger audiences, and the Tramp was becoming more than a simple comic figure. He was turning into a cultural symbol. Chaplin had taken the painful observations of his childhood, the poor trying to maintain dignity, the lonely searching for connection, the forgotten trying to survive, and transformed them into a universal language of movement and emotion. Without realizing at the time, Chaplin had begun creating something far larger than a career. He was shaping a character that the entire world would soon recognize. And as his fame grew, the young boy who once struggled to find food in London was quietly building one of the most powerful careers the entertainment industry had ever seen. By the early 1920s, Charlie Chaplin was no longer simply a popular film actor. He had become something far rarer, a global cultural figure whose influence extended far beyond the movie screen. In an era when silent films traveled easily across borders, Chaplin's work reached audiences in Europe, Asia, South America, and nearly every major city in the United States. The Tramp, with his bowler hat and crooked cane, had become instantly recognizable to millions of people who had never even seen Chaplin speak. What made Chaplin different from many of his contemporaries was his growing determination to control every aspect of his films. He was not satisfied with acting alone. He wrote stories, directed scenes, supervised editing, and carefully shaped the emotional rhythm of each production. This level of control allowed him to turn simple comedies into deeply human stories. Instead of relying only on slapstick chaos, Chaplin began weaving together humor and vulnerability, allowing audiences to laugh one moment and feel genuine sympathy the next. In 1921, Chaplin released Kid, a film that would prove how powerful this new approach could be. The story followed the Tramp as he reluctantly becomes a guardian of an abandoned child. What began as a comedy slowly evolved into something much more emotional. The film blended humor with tenderness in a way that silent cinema had rarely attempted before. Audiences responded immediately. The Kid became a massive success and confirmed that Chaplin was capable of telling stories that went far beyond simple entertainment. Just a few years later, Chaplin released another film that strengthened his reputation as one of the most creative minds in cinema. In 1925, The Gold Rush premiered and quickly became one of the most celebrated films of the decade. Set during the Klondike Gold Rush, the story followed the Tramp as he struggled to survive in a frozen wilderness while searching for fortune. The film contains some of Chaplin's most memorable scenes, including the moment when the starving Tramp cooks and eats his own shoe as if it were a gourmet meal. The mixture of desperation and elegance in that scene captured exactly what Chaplin had been perfecting since his earliest films, the ability to turn hardship into something strangely beautiful. By the time the film industry began transitioning to sound in the late 1920s, Chaplin was already one of the most powerful figures in Hollywood. Many studios rushed to embrace the new technology of talking pictures, but Chaplin hesitated. He believed the universal appeal of silent storytelling was too valuable to abandon too quickly. Instead of following the trend, he continued creating films that relied almost entirely on visual storytelling. In 1931, Chaplin released City Lights, a film that many critics would later describe as one of the greatest achievements in cinema history. Despite being produced during the early sound era, the film remained largely silent, using music and visual performance to carry the story. The narrative followed the tramp as he falls in love with a blind flower girl and struggles to help her regain her sight. The final scene, where the girl finally realizes who her mysterious benefactor truly is, remains one of the most emotionally powerful moments ever filmed. Chaplin followed the success with another ambitious project in 1936. Modern Times presented a satirical look at the growing industrial world, where machines and factory systems were beginning to reshape human life. In one of the film's most famous sequences, the tramp becomes trapped inside a giant machine, swallowed by moving gears as if he were another part of the factory itself. The image was both humorous and unsettling. Chaplin was no longer just entertaining audiences. He was quietly criticizing the modern world that surrounded them. By this point, Chaplin had achieved something few artists ever experience. He possessed enormous creative freedom, global fame, and financial independence. His films were watched by millions. His characters were instantly recognizable, and his influence stretched across the entire film industry. To many people, Chaplin represented the very heart of Hollywood. But while his career seemed stronger than ever on the surface, forces were beginning to gather in the background. The world was changing politically. Hollywood was becoming more powerful and more cautious. And Chaplin himself, with his outspoken opinions and controversial personal life, was slowly moving toward a conflict that would eventually threaten everything he had built. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, Charlie Chaplin appeared to stand at the absolute height of his influence. His films were watched across continents. Critics praised his artistic independence, and the character of the tramp had already secured a permanent place in cinema history. On the surface, Chaplin looked untouchable. Yet behind the scenes, the stability of his reputation was beginning to crack. Much of the tension surrounding Chaplin did not come from his films at first. It came from his personal life. For years, whispers had circulated through Hollywood about his relationships with very young women. Chaplin's private behavior, once ignored by studios because of his enormous popularity, began attracting growing attention from the press. In an industry that carefully controlled public images, Chaplin's independence made him difficult to manage. He did not belong to any studio system. He controlled his own productions, and he often ignored the expectations that governed other celebrities. The first major scandal erupted in the early 1920s when Chaplin married actress Mildred Harris. She was only 16 years old. The marriage itself raised eyebrows, but the situation quickly grew worse when Harris claimed she was pregnant. Chaplin, under pressure from both social expectations and legal concerns, agreed to marry her. Soon afterward, the pregnancy turned out to be either mistaken or fabricated. The relationship deteriorated rapidly, and the marriage ended in a highly publicized divorce. Newspapers treated the story as a spectacle, printing intimate details about their arguments and accusations. For a time, Chaplin's career remained strong enough to overshadow the scandal. But a second relationship soon pushed his reputation into even more dangerous territory. In 1924, Chaplin became involved with Lita Grey, another young actress who had appeared in one of his films. Grey was only 16 when the relationship began. When she became pregnant, Chaplin again rushed into marriage, fearing legal consequences that could have destroyed his career completely. What followed became one of the most explosive divorce cases Hollywood had ever seen. Grey's legal team released a long list of accusations describing Chaplin's private behavior in disturbing detail. The documents alleged emotional cruelty, strange sexual demands, and patterns of manipulation within the relationship. Whether every claim was accurate or exaggerated for legal advantage hardly mattered. The story exploded across newspapers in the United States and Europe. For months, Chaplin's private life became front-page news. The divorce settlement eventually cost him a massive financial payout, and the damage to his reputation was far more difficult to repair. Despite the controversy, Chaplin's creative success continued through the 1930s. Films like City Lights and Modern Times reinforced his status as one of cinema's greatest storytellers. But by the early 1940s, another storm was forming, one that combined personal scandal with the increasingly tense political climate of the time. The United States had entered a period of growing suspicion and ideological conflict. Political tensions following the Great Depression and the rise of global fascism created an atmosphere where public figures were often judged not only by their work, but also by their perceived political loyalties. Chaplin, who had always expressed sympathy for the poor and frequently criticized economic inequality in his films, suddenly found himself under a different kind of scrutiny. In 1940, Chaplin released A Great Dictator, a bold satire that openly mocked Adolf Hitler and condemned authoritarian power. The film contained one of Chaplin's most famous moments, a long speech calling for humanity, compassion, and resistance against tyranny. Many audiences admired the courage of the film, especially since it was produced before the United States officially entered World War II. But others saw Chaplin's political voice as suspicious. Some critics accused him of spreading left-leaning ideas. Others pointed out that Chaplin had lived in the United States for decades, but had never become an American citizen. In an era when patriotism was often measured in rigid ways, that detail became a powerful talking point for his opponents. The tension escalated dramatically in 1943, when a young actress named Joan Barry filed a lawsuit against Chaplin. Barry claimed that Chaplin was the father of a child and demanded financial support. The story quickly became a national sensation. Chaplin insisted the claim was false, and medical blood tests seemed to support his defense by indicating that he could not be the child's father. However, the legal system at that time did not fully accept such scientific evidence. In an astonishing decision, the court ruled that Chaplin must still pay child support despite the test results suggesting otherwise. The public reaction was brutal. Newspapers treated the case as proof that Chaplin's private life was deeply immoral. Political groups that already disliked his outspoken opinions now had an opportunity to intensify their attacks. Columnists questioned his loyalty to the United States, his personal character, and even the moral value of his films. At the same time, federal authorities were quietly increasing their attention on Chaplin. Under the leadership of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, investigators began compiling files on Chaplin's political connections and public statements. Hoover believed that influential artists could shape public opinion, and Chaplin's enormous popularity made him an especially interesting target. The investigation did not uncover clear evidence of illegal political activity, but the existence of the file itself contributed to the atmosphere of suspicion surrounding him. By the late 1940s, Chaplin's image had transformed dramatically in certain corners of American media. The man who had once symbolized innocence and humor was now portrayed by some commentators as a morally questionable outsider with dangerous political ideas. This shift was devastating because Chaplin had built a career on the emotional bond between himself and the public. For decades, audiences had viewed him as a sympathetic figure, a poor wanderer struggling against injustice. Now, headlines described him in far darker terms. Chaplin continued working, but the tone surrounding his life had changed completely. The laughter that once greeted his films was now accompanied by debate, suspicion, and hostility. And while Chaplin himself still believed in the power of storytelling, the world around him was becoming increasingly hostile to the man behind the Tramp. All of these tensions were quietly building toward a single moment, a moment that would arrive in 1952, when Chaplin stepped onto a ship in New York, believing he was simply traveling abroad to promote his newest film. Instead, that journey would become the beginning of his exile from the country where he had built his entire career. By the early 1950s, the atmosphere surrounding Charlie Chaplin in the United States had become increasingly hostile. Years of scandals, political suspicion, and relentless media criticism had slowly eroded the public image he once enjoyed. Chaplin was still respected by many artists and audiences, but powerful voices in politics and the press had begun framing him as an outsider who no longer belonged in American public life. In 1952, Chaplin completed a new film titled Limelight. Unlike many of his earlier works, this film felt deeply personal. It told the story of an aging comedian struggling with fading fame and self-doubt. The parallels between the character and Chaplin himself were difficult to ignore. After spending decades at the center of the entertainment world, Chaplin seemed increasingly aware that the industry around him had changed. Later that same year, Chaplin and his family boarded a ship in New York to travel to London for the film's premiere. The trip was meant to be temporary. Chaplin had traveled abroad many times before and fully expected to return to the United States once the promotional tour ended. But while the ship was crossing the Atlantic Ocean, a dramatic decision was made in Washington. The U.S. Attorney General announced that Chaplin's re-entry permit would be revoked. If Chaplin wished to return to the country where he had lived for more than 4 decades, he would first have to undergo an immigration hearing to determine whether he should be allowed back at all. The message was unmistakable. The government was prepared to challenge his right to live in the United States. For Chaplin, the announcement was both humiliating and clarifying. The country that had helped build his career was now questioning whether he belonged there. Instead of returning to fight a long legal battle, Chaplin made a quiet but decisive choice. He would not come back. After arriving in Europe, Chaplin began searching for a place where his family could settle permanently. He eventually chose Switzerland, purchasing a large estate overlooking Lake Geneva in the small village of Courcelles-sur-Vevey. The move marked the beginning of a completely different phase of his life. For the first time in decades, Chaplin was living far away from Hollywood, studio negotiations, and the relentless attention of American tabloids. His personal life also changed during this period. Chaplin had married Una O'Neill several years earlier, the daughter of famous playwright Eugene O'Neill. When they married in 1943, Chaplin was 54 and Una was 18, a difference that had shocked many observers at the time. Yet the marriage proved remarkably stable. In Switzerland, the couple built a large family together, eventually raising 8 children. Away from the constant pressure of Hollywood publicity, Chaplin appeared to find a level of domestic peace that had long eluded him. Professionally, Chaplin continued making films, though at a slower pace. In 1957, he released A King in New York, a satirical film that openly mocked the political paranoia he had experienced in the United States. The film criticized media hysteria, government surveillance, and the culture fear that had dominated the era. Although the movie was controversial, it also revealed that Chaplin had not lost his sharp sense of social observation. Living in Switzerland allowed Chaplin to reclaim something that had been almost impossible to maintain during his Hollywood years: distance. Without the daily pressure of American media scrutiny, he could reflect on his career from a new perspective. The boy who had once struggled to survive in London's poorest neighborhoods had become one of the most influential filmmakers in history, and yet the final chapters of his life were unfolding far away from the industry he had helped build. Chaplin's exile from the United States was not a dramatic escape or a sudden collapse. It was a quiet turning point, a moment when the man who had spent his life performing for audiences around the world stepped away from the center of the stage and began writing a different kind of ending to his story. By the mid-1950s, Charlie Chaplin's life had entered a phase that looked very different from the chaotic decades he had spent inside Hollywood. The estate he purchased in Courcelles-sur-Vevey, Switzerland, overlooked the calm waters of Lake Geneva, far removed from the noise of film studios, gossip columns, and political headlines. For the first time in many years, Chaplin lived in a place where his daily life was not constantly under public scrutiny. At home, the center of his world had become his family. Chaplin and Una O'Neill raised 8 children together, and the house was often filled with activity and laughter. The contrast with his own childhood could not have been greater. Where he had once grown up surrounded by instability, poverty, and institutions for the poor, his children now lived in a peaceful environment with security and opportunity. Friends who visited the Chaplin home in Switzerland often remarked on how relaxed he appeared compared to his intense working years in Hollywood. Although he had stepped away from the American film industry, Chaplin did not disappear from cinema completely. He continued writing, composing music, and occasionally revisiting his earlier films. In the late 1950s and 1960s, he re-released several of his silent classics with newly recorded musical scores that he personally composed. These projects allowed him to reshape how future audiences would experience the films that had originally made him famous. Meanwhile, Chaplin's reputation began slowly evolving. The political hostility that had surrounded him in the United States during the early Cold War gradually faded as cultural attitudes shifted. Younger filmmakers and critics began re-examining Chaplin's work, not simply as popular entertainment, but as a major artistic achievement. His films were studied in universities, screened in film festivals, and celebrated as masterpieces of visual storytelling. The change in perception became unmistakable in 1972 when the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences invited Chaplin back to the United States to receive an honorary Academy Award. For 20 years, he had not set foot in the country where he had built his career. When the elderly Chaplin finally walked onto the stage at the Academy Award ceremony, the audience rose to their feet. The applause continued for more than 10 minutes, one of the longest standing ovations in the history of the event. For Chaplin, the moment carried a powerful emotional weight. The same industry that had once turned against him was now recognizing the scale of his contribution. He had helped shape the language of cinema, proving that humor and tragedy could exist side by side without losing their impact. Charlie Chaplin died on December 25th, 1977, at the age of 88. By that time, the character he had created decades earlier, the quiet little tramp walking with stubborn dignity through a difficult world, had become one of the most enduring images in film history. Long after the controversies of his life faded, the films remained, and with them remained the strange, fragile balance Chaplin had always understood better than most artists. The idea that laughter and sorrow are often separated by only the smallest distance. Charlie Chaplin once said, "Life is a tragedy when seen in close-up, but a comedy in long shot." Few lives illustrate that idea more clearly than his own. Seen up close, Chaplin's life was filled with conflict. He grew up in extreme poverty. His mother struggled with mental illness. His personal relationships often attracted controversy. His name appeared in courtrooms, headlines, and political investigations. By the early 1950s, the country where he had built his entire career had effectively pushed him out. But when the camera pulls back, the story begins to look very different. Chaplin helped invent a new language for cinema, one that did not rely on dialogue or nationality. With a simple costume, a bowler hat, a cane, a pair of oversized shoes, he created a character understood across cultures and generations. The tramp was poor but proud, clumsy but resilient, always trying to preserve dignity in a world that rarely offered kindness. That character reflected something Chaplin knew deeply from his own childhood. He understood what it meant to feel invisible, to struggle quietly, and to keep moving forward despite humiliation. Instead of hiding those experiences, he transformed them into art. By the time he died in 1977 at the age of 88, Chaplin had lived through the rise of cinema itself. His work continued to influence filmmakers, comedians, and storytellers across the world. The boy who once stood on a small stage in London because his mother could no longer sing had gone on to create one of the most recognizable figures in human history. And perhaps that is the final irony of Charlie Chaplin's life. The man who made the world laugh so easily understood sadness better than almost anyone,